I am Alina Vance, a woman of 38 years, and my days unfold in the quiet rhythm of Willow Creek, Georgia. My pride and joy is the Willow Word, the independent bookstore I manage, a place brimming with the scent of old paper and new possibilities. I find comfort in its hushed atmosphere, in the carefully arranged shelves, and in the familiar faces of my regular customers. My life, much like the books I sell, is generally orderly and predictable, a collection of small routines that bring me deep satisfaction. I cherish politeness and respect, believing that a little consideration goes a long way in making the world a more pleasant place. I am not one to seek conflict, but I also possess a quiet strength, a firm belief in fairness that simmers beneath my calm exterior. My weekly trip to the fresh market is usually a moment of peaceful anticipation, a chance to gather provisions for my husband Mark and myself, and to enjoy a brief respite from the bustle of the world. One Tuesday, with my cart overflowing with fresh produce and household necessities, I found myself in the checkout line. I felt a pleasant sense of accomplishment, ready to head home and start dinner. That is when he appeared. A large man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a rumpled polo shirt and an air of impatient entitlement, wheeled his cart directly behind me. It began subtly, a gentle nudge against my cart, then a deliberate bump against my hip. I shifted, trying to create space, sending him a polite but firm look over my shoulder. He just offered a thin, unpleasant grin, a clear sign that this was no accident. The nudging continued, each time a little harder, a little more insistent. My blood began to simmer. This was not just about a grocery cart, it was about an invasion of my personal space, a brazen act of disrespect, a man trying to physically push me out of his way as if I were nothing more than an inanimate obstacle. His entitled smirk became a symbol of a broader problem I often observed, the increasing lack of basic civility in public spaces. I felt a familiar frustration rise within me, a sense of dissatisfaction with how some people simply dismiss the comfort and boundaries of others. This man, this stranger, had suddenly become my nemesis, challenging the very peace I sought to maintain. I decided to address the situation directly but gently, hoping to resolve it without further fuss. The next time his cart pushed into me, I carefully placed my hand on the metal handle of his cart and firmly, but without aggression, pushed it back a few inches. I turned and met his gaze, my expression calm but unyielding. He simply feigned innocence, letting out a tuneless whistle as if lost in thought, his eyes sliding away from mine. The young cashier, Kevin, glanced up from his register, then quickly looked back down, clearly wanting no part of the interaction. My gentle assertion had failed. A pang of disappointment went through me. My reasonable approach had been met with calculated dismissiveness. Then he did it again, this time with more force, the corner of his cart digging sharply into my side. An audible grunt escaped my lips, a sharp intake of breath as the dull ache spread. That was it. My patience, a well-worn garment, finally frayed. Without a word, I turned my body, seemingly to pick up an imaginary dropped item from the floor, and with a carefully controlled swing, I accidentally hip-checked that man right in his gut. A satisfying oof erupted from him, and he instinctively clutched his stomach, backing away a few feet, his face twisted in a surprised grimace. I finished my transaction, a small internal sense of triumph blooming in my chest. I thought, good, that's over. He learned his lesson. But it was not over. As I gathered my large bags and moved to the bagging area, I caught his eye again. His glare was cold, devoid of mere annoyance, instead filled with something akin to vindictiveness. A shiver ran down my spine, a premonition of unease. Later, as I carefully loaded my groceries into the trunk of my car, I saw him again. He was lingering by his own vehicle, parked a few rows away, not actively approaching but unmistakably watching me. His gaze felt heavy, unsettling. Then slowly he got into his car and drove away. The next Tuesday, the following week, I returned to Fresh Market, hoping the incident was forgot. But there he was again, the same man. He made a point of selecting the line directly behind me, even though other checkout lanes were wide open. This time he did not bump my cart, but his presence felt suffocating. He mumbled loudly about slow people and time wasters, clearly intending for me to hear every word. I felt my anxiety rise, a slow creep of dread. My once peaceful sanctuary, the grocery store, now felt tainted, a place of potential confrontation. I found myself constantly on edge, glancing over my shoulder, my senses heightened to his every move. The initial satisfaction of my hip check had evaporated, replaced by annoying worry. I had not solved the problem, I had merely inflamed it. I had made an enemy, a petty one perhaps, but an enemy nonetheless, and his persistent presence was making my everyday life uncomfortable. I tried to vary my shopping times, but sometimes it was simply unavoidable. Each time I spotted him, my heart would sink, and I would feel my hard-won peace slowly eroding. I was losing my calm, my sense of security, and the feeling of vulnerability was becoming deeply unsettling. I realized I could not continue living with this low-level dread. This was more than just an annoyance, it was an encroachment on my peace of mind. I needed to address this problem, not with another physical confrontation which had only escalated the issue, but with something smarter, something that utilized my own strengths, observation, patience, and subtle influence. I began to watch him, not obsessively, but with a quiet, focused attention whenever our paths crossed. I noticed a pattern. The man, whose name I had by now overheard was Gerald, was always in a hurry, always trying to cut corners, and often complained loudly and aggressively about the smallest things, especially pricing discrepancies or issues with coupons. His impatience was his greatest weakness, a gaping flaw in his otherwise brutish demeanor. One particular Tuesday, my shopping cart once again full, I found myself in the checkout line. Gerald, predictably, was directly behind me. I noticed a new cashier, a young woman with nervous eyes, looking visibly flustered. Gerald immediately began to loudly complain about a sale item that was not ringing up at the correct price. His voice was aggressive, booming, making the young cashier visibly shrink under his verbal assault. I saw my opportunity, a delicate window that required precise timing and a steady hand. I stepped up to the register, my expression sweet and innocent. "Oh, before you scan my first item," I began, my voice clear and polite, speaking directly to the new cashier, "I was wondering if you could help me. I've been really thinking about getting one of those Fresh Market loyalty cards. Kevin, the cashier I usually have, explained it to me last time and he was wonderful, but I'm still a little unsure about the point system and exactly how the discounts work on different days. Could you possibly walk me through it from the very beginning, even the parts about signing up? I really want to understand it completely." Gerald let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh so loud it echoed slightly in the quiet hum of the store. "Are you serious?" he muttered, his voice dripping with barely contained fury. "Some of us have places to be." I turned to him, my smile utterly guileless. "Oh, I do apologize, sir," I said, my tone overflowing with feigned sincerity, "but it's really quite important to me to understand these things fully. I'm absolutely certain it won't take but a moment." The new cashier, clearly relieved to have a polite customer after Gerald's aggression, gratefully began to explain the loyalty program in excruciating detail, pulling out colorful brochures and demonstrating on the screen. I nodded thoughtfully, asking follow-up questions about specific types of discounts, whether my husband could have a separate card linked to my account, the intricacies of the privacy policy, and even the recommended font size on the monthly statements. I made sure to appear utterly engrossed, hanging on her every word. Gerald's face began to turn a mottled beet red. He shifted his weight impatiently from foot to foot, huffed audibly, pulled out his phone only to glare at it, and then slammed it back into his pocket with a frustrated grunt. His grumbling grew louder, a low growl that permeated the air. He began to pace frantically behind me, bumping into a display of impulse buys, sending a few candy bars tumbling to the floor. Finally, unable to contain his frustration, he demanded to speak to a manager, his voice rising into a furious rant about incompetent staff and customers holding up the line with frivolous questions. His outburst was loud enough to attract attention from across the store. A manager, Ms. Jenkins, a stern but fair woman whom I knew from my consistent weekly visits, walked purposefully over, her gaze firm as she assessed the situation, drawn by Gerald's clamorous complaints. "Sir, is there a problem here?" Ms. Jenkins asked, her voice even as she looked from me, patiently listening to the cashier, to Gerald, who was practically vibrating with barely contained rage. Gerald immediately launched into a fresh tirade, pointing dramatically at me and loudly complaining about my unnecessary questions and the abysmally slow service. I looked up at Ms. Jenkins with wide, innocent eyes. "Oh, I am so very sorry, Ms. Jenkins," I said, my voice filled with concern. "Am I holding things up? I just really want to understand the loyalty program. It's quite complex, isn't it? The young lady here is doing her absolute best to explain it thoroughly, bless her heart." I beamed at the new cashier, who offered me a small, grateful smile. Ms. Jenkins, who I knew had a long history of dealing with Gerald's antics, gave him a pointed, unyielding look. "Sir," she stated, her voice calm but firm, "our employees are trained to assist all customers with all their questions. If you are truly in such a hurry, perhaps you could consider using our express lane next time or returning during a less busy period. This customer is simply exercising her right to understand our services fully." She then turned her attention to the new cashier. "Take your time, dear. Make sure the customer understands everything, no matter how long it takes." Gerald was utterly deflated. The wind had completely gone out of his sails. He tried to argue a few sputtering words, but Ms. Jenkins stood firm, her gaze unyielding. He finally realized he had lost, his own impatience having backfired spectacularly and publicly. He was forced to stand there, fuming silently as I continued to ask precise, detailed questions, subtly drawing out the loyalty card process for another 5 excruciating minutes. He could not leave the line without losing his hard-won spot, and every other checkout line had grown significantly longer during his outburst. When I finally finished, receiving my new loyalty card and a triumphant smile from the new cashier, Gerald was forced to step forward, his anger now clearly directed at his own colossal bad luck and foolishness. A deep, satisfying calm washed over me, a feeling more profound than any quick triumph. It was not about violence or even a shouted argument. It was about using his own obvious weaknesses against him, exposing his rudeness to authority, and making him suffer the very inconvenience he delighted in inflicting upon others. I had subtly, intelligently restored a sense of balance. A week later, I returned to Fresh Market, feeling light and unburdened. As I approached the checkout area, my eyes caught a new sign displayed prominently at the express lane: customers displaying abusive or disruptive behavior will be asked to leave. A small, private smile played on my lips. Then I saw Gerald. He was in a different line, but he caught my eye. Instead of his usual arrogant glare, there was a flicker of something new in his eyes: apprehension. He quickly looked away, avoiding my gaze. I realized he had learned his lesson, not just about me, but about the very real consequences of his habitual bad behavior. As I walked out, my grocery bags in hand, I passed Ms. Jenkins, who happened to be stocking a display of seasonal fruit. She met my gaze and offered me a knowing wink. I winked back, a silent understanding passing between us, a shared acknowledgement of a battle won not with brute force but with quiet wit. And then, as I walked towards my car, I overheard Ms. Jenkins speaking into her walkie-talkie, her voice low but clear. "Yes, that's him," she said. "Make sure all the cashiers know to activate the loyalty card protocol if he tries any nonsense. And don't forget the slow scan for all his regular items. He needs to truly learn." A wide, unbidden smile spread across my face. My revenge, I realized, was not just a one-time event. It was a carefully constructed, ongoing inconvenience for Gerald, a silent symphony of retail justice, orchestrated by the entire store, a continuous reminder of the power of courtesy and the high cost of rudeness.